Hi everyone, I'm Donna Louise and welcome to my YouTube channel for the love of puzzles. Today I have a very special guest. Wendy's back!
Hi!
Yay!
Yay!
So if you haven't seen our previous videos, Wendy and I built some puzzles together and we also tried to solve some murder mysteries. And how well did we do on the last Cluedo murder mystery?
We did well. The mystery itself did really bad.
I'll leave the links in the description below if you want to go check out those videos. I also did a blooper reel because, yeah, there's bloopers, people. So I decided since we didn't do so great at the last Cluedo murder mystery that we would try to do another one. So do you want to show everyone what we're doing today? Dun, dun, dun.
Death in the first edition.
Yeah, so this is another Cluedo murder mystery jigsaw puzzle. As with the other ones, spoilers, we will be reading the story as we time-lapse the jigsaw puzzle build. We don't know what the puzzle looks like. There's no indication on the cover, on the box. I mean, I think there's books and chess pieces. That's about all that tells us. So we will be building the puzzle, we will be revealing the puzzle, and we will try to solve the murder. Who did it? Now, we've already read the story. I have some ideas. You have ideas.
I have some ideas.
But we have to wait to see if the puzzle itself helps us. Do we want to reveal our ideas before we build the puzzle?
Yes.
Okay, so can I go first with my idea? And as you hear the story, you'll know what I'm talking about. They specifically talk about two women going in the kitchen and making cocoa. I think that if in the jigsaw puzzle there's cups of cocoa, I think they poison the cocoa, and the Dr. David Black is always the one who gets murdered, by the way, same as in the last one. I think he gets poisoned. I think the stains, the wetness on the carpet might be like the cup has spilt and the cocoa's on the carpet. And I think he, like, in his state of poisonness, stumbles outside, falls, and maybe hits his head on the lead pipe. And that's just like a secondary thing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, but then again, I need to build the jigsaw puzzle. So that's my initial guess here. What's your initial guess?
My initial guess is that it's Professor Plum.
Okay, why?
Because he's the only one that is alone, not doing an activity with someone else within the story.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it was just something in the story.
The way he was?
The way it was read leads me to believe it's him.
Because he does say that in the story, and again, you'll hear the whole story, when they're asking everyone, where were you? He does say that he was by himself
looking for some light for reading for bed.
Yes,
yeah.
And everything takes place in the library.
Yeah.
And so he does kind of implicate himself as being alone in the library.
Yes.
And the last place we saw Dr. David Black alive
was in the library,
sorting his books.
Yeah, I say I guess it is Professor Plum in the library with the lead pipe.
So you think the lead pipe is the true murder weapon?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a bit more to figure out because, as you'll hear from the story, there's only one set of footsteps to the body leading out. So how does the body get there with only one set of footsteps? But we'll try to figure it out. So those are our initial guesses. We have no idea if we're right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But for the love of puzzles, let's get to building. Death in the First Edition by Henry Slezar. To Charles John Huffman Dickens. There was an odd response to his toast as David Black lifted his wineglass above the heads of his 6 seated dinner guests. None of them touched a glass. None of them smiled or showed the slightest answering sentiment. In fact, a flash photograph of the scene would have revealed a frown, a scowl, a glare, and in the case of at least 3 of the diners, a grimace of pure hatred. The truth is, not one of his guests wanted to be present at what Dr. Black, with his Dickensian obsessions, called his Great Expectations dinner party. Not only did they despise Dr. Black, they loathed exposing themselves to each other's company. Both reactions were easy to understand. All 6 of Dr. Black's guests were his patients, very special patients, all suffering from the same disease, blackmail. They had all growled with displeasure when they received the dinner invitation, but they knew Dr. Black too well to be surprised. It wasn't the first time they had been forced into his company. Black, with typical self-delusion, preferred to believe he was offering therapy to his victims. The payments he extorted from them were presented as medical services. But there were no hope of recovering the staggering sums from the National Health Service, since Dr. Black's title was no longer legitimate. Black didn't mind giving up his medical practice. He was far too interested in his hobby, or rather, his passion. Dr. Black collected rare books. He loved first editions. He crooned over ancient leather-bound works. He went into raptures at rare book auctions and exhibitions. But he also discovered the sad fact that most rare book prices were well beyond the income of a simple village physician. Fortunately for him, Dr. Black discovered an effective way to meet those costs. He had several wealthy patients with country homes in the vicinity of his small surgery. With the innocent questions about their history, he slowly gathered a list of secrets that were worth a small fortune. When one of his early victims threatened to expose him to the authorities, Black took care of that difficulty. He resigned his practice and retired to indulge his hobby, collecting books and blackmail fees. Those fees mounted steadily over the years. Dr. Black accumulated so many fine books, including a dozen sets of first edition Dickens, that he was soon crowded out of his modest cottage. He knew he would have to move to find a new home for his precious volumes. And then the perfect opportunity came his way. Tudor Close was for sale. It was one of England's finest estates, with high vaulted rooms, luxurious furnishings, and splendid grounds. But Tudor Close was something Dr. Black valued even more. It had a magnificent library. As the dinner drew to a close, Dr. Black grew more and more exhilarated at the prospect of showing off his new acquisition. It was true that the library wasn't quite finished. There was still some cataloging to be done, some shelves to be adjusted, some titles to be arranged, and Dr. Black was painfully meticulous about having everything in perfect alphabetical order. He was proud of the room's thick carpeting, its wood paneling, the chess table with its exquisite alabaster pieces, and most of all, he was proud of his books. Then the waiting was over. The last liquor was downed, the last mint digested, the last toast toasted. Dr. Black rose and ushered his guests to the doors that led to the most important room in Tudor Close. With a dramatic flourish, he threw open the doors and let his guests feast their eyes. Professor Peter Plum wasn't impressed by what he saw in Dr. Black's library. A transplanted American, these days he considered himself more a man of action than of intellect. His favorite room was his home gymnasium. He had read enough books in his academic career, and he hadn't the slightest interest in indoor games. There was only one object in the room that interested him. It was a Roman spear displayed on the far wall. He would have liked nothing better than to yank it from its moorings and bury its blade into Dr. Black's throat, especially after their private conversation before dinner. "It looks like I'll have to increase your medical fee," Dr. Black had told him cheerfully. "Tudor Close is wonderful, but the upkeep is horrendous. I'm sure you understand." Professor Plum understood only too well. He had understood Dr. Black from the day the physician came to his house to treat the professor's wife for food poisoning. After none too subtle hints about the monthly health insurance payment, the doctor prepared a death certificate that blamed Mrs. Plum's untimely end on salmonella in the chicken and not on the cyanide in her trifle. Mrs. Elizabeth Peacock had concocted that fatal dessert, as Dr. Black had easily determined. She didn't usually choose such unpalatable ingredients. The widowed Mrs. Peacock considered herself a gourmet. She loved to eat well, but she had to admit that there was little pleasure in dining alone. When Professor Plum moved into the neighborhood, she found herself succumbing to his blunt charm. To this day, Mrs. Peacock wasn't sure which one of them proposed the quick solution that would free them to marry. But after the deed was done, the professor and Mrs. Peacock discovered that they had nothing at all in common, except Dr. David Black. "I'm sure you won't mind," missing 25 pounds a month, Dr. Black had told her with a toothy grin. Eventually, the 25 pounds became 50, and then 75. And when she received the invitation to the Great Expectations dinner, she felt certain that Dr. Black had new expectations of his own. "It's the taxes, you see," Dr. Black explained as they strolled in the grounds. "They're infernally high for a place this size. So shall we make it an even 100? Mrs. Blanche White had been surprised by Dr. Black's decision to seat her with the other guests at the dinner table. She was a servant, after all, and there was still protocol to be observed, even in this liberalized society. In truth, Mrs. White would have been much happier to keep her distance from Tudor Close. Dr. Black, and the memory of that terrible night, the night when Professor Plum's wife died, and the physician presented her with what he called laboratory proof of the fatal error she had made. Mrs. White swore she had prepared the trifle exactly as Mrs. Peacock had ordered, but the doctor had merely looked at her with doleful eyes. "You made an error, Mrs. White," he said gravely. "You added a fatal ingredient without realizing it, and now a woman is dead. But," he sighed, "I don't want to see you suffer. If you could possibly suggest some compensation?" The terrified Mrs. White had only one asset in the world, the trust fund her husband had left her, £12,000 for her old age. The £12,000 was now sitting in Dr. Black's library at Tudor Close, the price he had paid for the 3-part first edition of Oliver Twist. But of course, Mrs. White didn't know a first edition from a fruitcake. All she knew was that Dr. David Black was a man who didn't deserve to live. The Reverend Jonathan Green professed an interest in only one book, but there were many books in the Reverend's life, including little black books, filled with names like Happy Dan, Rutabaga, Jolly Warrior, and other charming names that horsemen like to give their racing breed. The Reverend knew when the addiction began. He had taken a long shot at the urging of a persuasive young lady who found it amusing to watch a man of the cloth imploring God in heaven for a winner. When the horse, a 30-to-1 shot, actually won, she had a new respect for the power of prayer. Unfortunately, Reverend Green also discovered a new respect for the bookmaker's craft. The inevitable happened. His choices began to falter. Not even the most earnest prayer changed the result at the finishing line. He began using money from the church fund. Even worse, he used money that existed only in his imagination. One day in desperation, he placed an enormous wager on a horse named Rosy Fingers. Rosy Fingers came in a poor second, and 2 large, well-muscled men came to the church with a collection plate of their own. Reverend Green suffered a beating that required medical attention. It was under sedation that the Reverend's babbling lips revealed the truth to Dr. David Black. Fortunately, the doctor also learned that the lead horse in the fateful race had just been disqualified. Rosy Fingers was the winner, and the bet paid out enough to build a new steeple. But Dr. Black had other ideas. Reverend Green could buy something more precious, his silence. Miss Vivian Scarlett looked into the library and knew immediately what was wrong with the decor. There were no mirrors. A room without mirrors was totally useless in her opinion. What good was being beautiful if you couldn't catch a single glimpse of yourself? Miss Scarlett always needed the reassurance of mirrors because there were times when men failed her. Dr. Black was the perfect example. When she first moved into the vicinity, she had heard the village gossips discuss his skills, his bedside manner, and his bachelorhood. Even though Miss Scarlett had a romantic connection, a very rich stockbroker in London, who made generous contributions to her lifestyle, Dr. Black sounded exactly like the kind of man whose adoration she craved. She decided to develop symptoms. Dr. Black proved highly susceptible. He was also highly ingenious. He recorded their amorous encounters on film so that he could cherish the memories forever. But one day, he tired of cherishing and decided to profit a bit. He calmly informed Miss Scarlett that he thought her stockbroker friend might enjoy seeing her photographs. It hadn't been easy for Vivian Scarlett to survive on only half the income that her friend in London gave her, but those were Dr. Black's terms. However, just before his Great Expectations dinner, Dr. Black put his arm around her creamy shoulders and said, "I'm afraid the price of film has just gone up." Colonel Mike Mustard didn't even glance at Dr. Black's bookshelves. He did look at his chess table, though, his fingers itching with the desire to pit one polished piece against the other. He was a dedicated player and had once tried to organize a village tournament. It was less than successful. Mrs. Peacock played a tolerable game, and even her cook knew her way around the board, but neither presented any challenge. Vivian Scarlett was even worse. She spent more time looking into her compact mirror than at the chessmen. Reverend Green played a solid game, but he was excruciatingly slow. Only Dr. David Black was a worthwhile opponent, and it had been the basis of their friendship, a friendship that turned enmity. One day at the Colonel's house, Mustard returned from the kitchen with the tea tray and found the doctor examining the medals on display in a glass frame. He thought nothing of it at the time, but on the occasion of their very next game, Dr. Black paused with his black queen twirling between two fingers and said, "By the way, Colonel, why don't you use the letters VC after your name? You're entitled to do so since you won the Victoria Cross." Mustard sputtered something about modesty, and Dr. Black smiled. "Can it be that the medal doesn't belong to you? I happen to know that all VCs have the recipient's name on the back. I flipped it over, and it seemed to have been awarded to Major Weaver. It would be interesting to find out how you got it." Dr. Black never found out because Colonel Mustard shared half of his retirement pay with him every month. The thought of those payments made his fingers itch again for the feel of Dr. Black's throat. It was a grueling evening for all concerned, although Dr. Black seemed to enjoy it immensely. He regaled them with a story about A Christmas Carol, about Dickens' almost Scrooge-like disappointment with the initial sales. "The great Christmas myth of our time," Black said with a beatific smile. "Who can forget Ebenezer and the ghost of Jacob Marley and Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim?" His guests looked perfectly willing to forget them all and go home. But nature conspired against them. At 10 p.m., a violent thunderstorm shook the windows of Tudor Close and drenched the area with so much rain that every access road was flooded. There was simply no choice for Dr. Black's 6 guests. They had to spend the night. At midnight, the mansion was as still as a tomb, and only sounds were the steady drumbeat of rain on the roof and the slow ticking of numerous clocks. But within moments after those clocks had tolled the midnight hour, the rain lightened and the sound of a muffled conversation could be heard in the vicinity of Dr. Black's library. Then there was only silence, followed by a horrifying punctuation mark. It was a scream of mortal agony. At first, the scurrying guests and frightened servants couldn't find the source of that chilling sound. Dr. Black wasn't in his downstairs bedroom, nor the living room, dining room, or study. He had last been seen in the library, but that room, too, was empty. It was Mrs. White who noticed the differences in the room. 2 damp spots on the carpet, directly in front of the table with a chess game still in progress. When she pointed to them, the others, reminded of the rain still spattering against the glass, looked towards the French windows that opened onto the gardens of Tudor Close. One of the windows was ajar. It was Professor Plum who reached it first and flung it open. A gust of cold, wet air entered the library and made the guests shudder. Colonel Mustard, with his customary military bravura, led the way outside. The house lights lit the path ahead of them. They also clearly lit a single set of footprints embedded in the soft, wet earth of the freshly turned garden soil. They followed them in fascination until they came to their end, a terrible end. "Look!" Vivian Scarlett cried. "By the rose bushes, there's something there. It looks like a body." "Don't touch it! Don't touch anything," Reverend Green said. "We must call the police." "But maybe he's still alive," Mrs. Peacock said. "Maybe we should get medical help." "Alive?" Colonel Mustard said, his voice full of contempt. "Look again, my dear woman. Look at his head." "Dear heaven!" Mrs. White cried. "And there's the murder weapon," Vivian Scarlet said. Their eyes followed the bright red tip of her pointing finger. It led them to the length of lead pipe lying only inches from the doctor's battered head. Not even the rain could wash away the blood that stained it. They looked into each other's faces, each one only too aware that they shared a common motive, hatred of the blackmailer. If one pair of eyes showed more guilt than the other, it was impossible to tell in the darkness of the garden. But one fact was quickly discernible. It was Mrs. Peacock who put it into words. "Hasn't anyone noticed?" she said with a hint of hysteria. "Look at the ground. Look how wet it is. Look at the footprints we made getting out here." "I don't understand," her cook said. "Isn't it obvious?" Professor Plum said dryly. "There's only one set of footprints leading to the body. Obviously, Dr. Black's own footprints." "What's so strange about that?" Miss Scarlet said. "Somebody must have called him out to the garden and then struck him down?" "Doesn't sound very likely," the Reverend said nervously. "Why would he walk out in the rain?" "And even if he did," the Colonel said, "the murderer would have had to walk away from the scene of the crime, wouldn't he?" "It's just amazing," Mrs. Peacock said. "Murder in a damp garden and no footprints? Who killed him? Marley's ghost?" "I think we should call the police," Mrs. White said. "And I think we should all talk it over first," the Colonel said gruffly. "The police are liable to ask more questions than some of us may care to answer. Do I make myself clear?" "He's right," Reverend Green said. "It probably was a tramp who killed him, but the police are liable to think it was one of us." "We'd better get our story straight," the professor said. "Now, where was Black when we all went to bed?" "Still in the library," Colonel Mustard answered, "cataloging his damned books, putting them all in alphabetical order, the compulsive fool. The Reverend and I were playing chess while he worked." "I was there too," Miss Scarlet said, "watching them play." "The word is meddling," the Colonel said. "I would have won the game if you hadn't told me to castle. Cost me my damned bishop." "You should have known the Reverend is very good with bishops," Mrs. White tittered. "And where were you, Mrs. White?" the professor asked. "Well, since there was only one chessboard, Mrs. Peacock and I were both in the kitchen making some cocoa." "That's right," Mrs. Peacock said. "And where were you, Professor?" "I was looking for a little light bedtime reading." "You know what I think?" Mrs. Scarlet said, beginning to shiver. "I think we should all go back to the library right now." By the time they reached the library, they discovered that the servants had already summoned the police. Only one of them had arrived, a small, wispy inspector called Barnes, with a ragged mustache and very damp clothes. He looked for all of the world like an old sheepdog that had fallen into a pond, and Miss Scarlet couldn't conceal a giggle of amusement. But less than an hour later, they discovered that Inspector Barnes wasn't a sheepdog after all. After hearing their stories and studying all the fine artifacts displayed in the library, the inspector seemed more like a bloodhound. He quickly spotted the clues that identified the murder of Dr. David Black. You can see the same clues yourself by assembling the jigsaw puzzle. Can you spot the clues that Inspector Barnes did? Can you unveil Dr. David Black's murderer?
And we're done. We've completed the jigsaw puzzle. Wendy, what are some of your ideas? Just the puzzle, the image, the pieces. Dark.
Really, really dark.
So, similarly to the last Cluedo puzzle we did, dark, but I felt this one wasn't as bad or as difficult as the last Cluedo one.
I think because it had the lamp was really distinctive.
Yes.
And those books were really distinctive.
Yes.
So you had parts that you could easily build.
Yeah, and the chess pieces a bit. But yeah, these photos with out of focus areas, why? And it is a glossy finish a bit, so it was kind of hard in the light. But I think what really helped is there's a good variety of piece shapes.
Yes.
And they're really wonky, which is really nice. So that was good. Now, I'm going to quickly say that there are no cups of cocoa. So my initial suspicions are wrong. However, now I'm thinking, yes, you're correct. The lead pipe is definitely the murder weapon. And there is blood on the chessboard right here.
Could be blood.
And I was thinking that might be blood on the base of the lamp.
And I'm thinking it's just a shadow.
No, yeah, so I'm thinking whacked with the lead pipe in the library here, blood, which leads me to believe Professor Plum, like you suspected, because he was the one looking for some light reading. But also, what else do we know from the puzzle?
The glasses.
The glasses. We looked up, and from the images of the characters, Professor Plum wears wireframe glasses.
He's the only one that wears the glasses.
Yeah, so why would his glasses be here? I'm assuming they're his glasses. Okay, so Professor Plum, lead pipe, in the library. Is there anything else? I thought maybe the books would have something to do, but I didn't figure out. Just, it's hard to read the wording on the books. The first one is it Pickwick Papers? So PP, Professor Plum?
Could be.
I mean, do you feel, okay, so you've heard the story. How did he get the body out and how did he get back in?
My theory is he carried the body, like Plum carried the body out.
Okay, one set of footprints.
Dumped him in the garden and climbed back through the window, because in the story it says that he was the first one to rush and open an already opened window, and that's how the wet spots got on the carpet.
Okay, but how did he only leave one set of footprints?
Because if he walked out with the body and then climbed through the library window, he didn't have to go back into the house.
Do you mean like he
carried out the body, dumped it in the garden, then climbed in a window?
Oh, I see. So he went through the house somehow, carried the body out, walked back in.
Well, didn't walk back in, he climbed back in.
Walked and climbed in the window. Yeah. He does grab for the window first, and maybe because his fingerprints were on it, so then that's how he justifies. And rereading the story, there's comments like he says things like, "We need to get our story straight."
Yeah.
Like and then he like uses words like, "Obviously, that's what happened," kind of thing.
Yeah.
What if he actually went out that window or door? Is it a window or a door? Because they all leave the library to go. They do call it a window, but
he opens the window, but then they leave the library. So I'd say they walk out of the library and around.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because he could have walked to the body and walked backwards through his footsteps, maybe.
It's a possibility.
I don't know.
It just seems a bit. I would just climb back through the window personally, but
so at least definitely Professor Plum, lead pipe in the library, dumped the body, and got back.
Somehow.
And left the wet spots from the rain.
Yeah, from
the wet
feet.
Yeah, the wet spots are from rain.
Yeah.
Well, let's just read the ending. So this is pretty cool. So the story comes in a little booklet here, and at the back of the booklet there is literally this. The story is written in black, but you need this red filter loupe. What's this in English?
Magnifying glass.
Magnifying glass to read through it. It is a bit, convoluted and kind of difficult at times, but we'll see what we can go. Okay. Here's the solution. Now, if you have not done this puzzle,
stop now.
Stop now, finish the puzzle and come back. So let's see. Okay, the damp spots on the library carpet were clearly made by the killer. Okay, so the killer was outside in the rain, I guess, who returned to the library after bludgeoning Dr. Black. Okay. But a careful observer can determine that the murder took place in the library itself, since the chess pieces on the board were not in their proper positions.
I'm not a chess player, so
I just thought it was a game still in progress. I didn't pay much attention that the pieces were not in their proper places.
Really, it's hard to tell what piece is what anyway.
Yeah.
So
I get, if you know chess, like if the board.
I know chess. But
I guess you would assume that there would just be two lines of pieces and they wouldn't be all over the place.
Yeah.
But to me,
it's just a game that got left.
Yeah. I didn't really pay much attention to the chess pieces. But I guess, so what does that imply? Because they do talk about each person, how well they know chess.
Yes.
Is he the one that knows the least? Who knows the least amount?
I can't remember.
I don't remember either. Okay. Oh, sorry. On the board were not in their proper positions. Obviously, they had been knocked over in a struggle and replaced by someone who didn't know how chessmen were arranged. So whoever knows the least about chess, maybe then. Then the killer removed Dr. Black's shoes. Okay. Put them on and carried the dead body out to the garden. He put the shoes back on the dead man's feet and retraced the footsteps in his socks. But when he returned to the library, he was unaware that Dr. Black had already named the murderer. So, okay, he retraced
So
the
he did
footstep.
what you thought, he retraced them.
And then he got his socks wet, went back to the library, supposedly to fix the chess pieces, but he made them look all wonky and left the 2 wet spots from his feet. But now it's saying that Dr. Black named his murderer, I'm not sure how, sitting on the table, no longer in alphabetical order, were 4 of Dickens' works. Pickwick Papers, which is why I thought maybe Professor Plum, but Little Dorrit, Uncommercial Traveler, and Martin Chuzzlewit. The first letter of each title spelt out the name of the man who had been threatening Dr. Black just before the murder. So Plum, Plum.
Done.
He had time to rearrange the box.
Yeah, no, I think if you're thinking you're getting murdered, you're not thinking about rearranging books.
This is Dr. Black just before the murder. The non-chess player. So he must be Professor Plum. So he must be the person in the store. I'm sure if we re-looked, it probably mentions he knows the least about chess. And that's it. It doesn't actually talk about his glasses.
But the whole story doesn't add up once again because, I'm going to pull this whole Cluedo story to pieces.
Okay.
Because it says, like, they'd all gone to bed.
Yeah.
And there was a scream or however they...
Yeah.
And everyone come running.
Yeah.
Surely the scream happened as soon as Plum was hit the first time. So how did he have time to get the body out into the garden and back into the library?
Oh, you're right. You're right. Because they do say that. They heard...
They do.
It was a scream of mortal agony.
And they all come scurrying.
Oh, but at first the scurrying guests and frightened servants couldn't find the source of that chilling sound. So they didn't see Plum carry the body out.
And they would have come running straight away. And you can't tell me carrying a fully grown man out of a house was going to be an easy feat. So there you go.
Okay, Wendy. First question. Did we do better at solving this one than the first one? Yes, I think so.
We actually got the murder weapon this time.
Yes, the murder weapon. We knew who it was. Yeah.
It's not as confusing or overthought as the first one, but there's still
holes
in the story.
The puzzle was better to assemble than the first one.
Yes.
Should we open a detective agency?
I think we should. Good old CSI.
Would we do another Cluedo? I think we're done with Cluedo.
Yeah, I think I would do another mystery puzzle, but just maybe not Cluedo because these stories just don't...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're done. This will be the last Cluedo, or Clue for our North American counterparts, murder mystery jigsaw puzzle. It was fun and all, but the story... Yeah, it's just... And really, what did this tell us?
I watch enough CSIs to know that there's big holes in that whole story.
I would have thought the glasses were more implicating than the books.
Or even the chess pieces, because how many people understand a game of chess?
It's being played. I thought it was just a game in progress. So all of this meant nothing. This puzzle could have literally been... much, 100 pieces.
And those titles needed to be more... Because you can't even read
You can't even read the titles. No. You really can't even read the titles. I knew about the alphabetical order thing. I thought more the PP for Professor Plum. But that was just me. Oh, Lord. Okay, we still got the murderer, though.
We did.
He's going to jail.
I think we got the murderer both times, didn't we?
We did. The last one, we did not figure out the murder weapon. The chandelier. Don't even get us started. Oh my goodness. Again, Wendy, thank you so much. I really appreciate you puzzling with me.
It was fun.
Yeah. It's always a good time.
It was fun.
Yeah. We'll get there. You better, if there's a murder mystery jigsaw puzzle out there, we'll solve it in the end. We'll get there one way or another. And thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. For the love of puzzles, I hope you enjoy my videos. Please consider subscribing. And until next time, ciao!